Jung's most unsettling discovery wasn't simply about healing from trauma. It was about the final stage of the empath. After enduring narcissistic abuse, a stage so powerful that it either completely destroys them or transforms them into something Jung considered psychologically unprecedented. In his clinical work, Jung observed empaths who had survived years of systematic narcissistic manipulation. Some of them reached what he described as the final stage of empathic development. Individuals who didn't just recover, but underwent a radical psychological metamorphosis. These were not ordinary healing stories. They were transformations that produced what Jung called integrated shadow consciousness and a remarkable immunity to all forms of manipulation. Jung considered this discovery dangerous because empaths who reached this stage often became almost unrecognizable to the people around them. They developed what he termed sovereign empathy, the ability to feel deeply and compassionately while remaining completely untouchable on a psychological level. This state created a type of consciousness Jung admitted he had rarely encountered in his career. In today's discussion, we'll explore Jung's most dangerous insight about the empath's final stage after narcissistic abuse, and why he believed this experience either annihilates empathy forever or transforms it into the archetype of the wounded healer, a form of consciousness that transcends both victimhood and mere survival. The case that brought this idea to life began in 1928 with a patient Jung identified in his private notes as M, a 34-year-old woman. M's profound empathic sensitivity had drawn her into a series of destructive relationships with narcissistic partners. By the time she came to Jung, she was in a state he described as psychically dissolved. Her sense of self so eroded that she could no longer distinguish her own emotions from the emotions of those around her. But what Jung documented over the next 2 years was nothing short of extraordinary. M did not simply recover. She went through what Jung likened to an alchemical transformation through shadow integration, where she had once been porous and vulnerable to every emotional current. She developed what Jung called conscious permeability, the deliberate ability to decide what she would absorb and what she would deflect. In his notes, Jung wrote, "M has achieved something I previously thought impossible, complete empathic sovereignty. She can feel the depths of another's suffering without being consumed by it. She detects deception with uncanny precision. Most astonishingly, she is entirely immune to manipulation, yet her compassion remains intact." The transformation was so profound that Jung questioned whether M was even the same person he had first met. Her family noticed immediately. Where she had once been the emotional caretaker of everyone around her, she now held boundaries that no one could cross. Some friends accused her of becoming distant or cold, but Jung recognized the truth. M had reached the final stage of empathic development, a level of integration and sovereignty he had only theorized might be possible. Jung noted something extraordinary about M's transformation. Even her eyes had changed. "They hold depths I have never seen," he wrote, as if she has stared into the abyss of human nature and returned not shattered but profoundly wise. From this case, Jung concluded that narcissistic abuse creates what he described as the empathic crucible, as a kind of psychological pressure chamber that either annihilates empathy completely or forges it into something far more refined and powerful. The central mechanism of this process, he believed, was shadow integration through forced individuation. During the cycle of narcissistic abuse, the empath is relentlessly confronted with their own shadow, the hidden, disowned aspects of themselves. Jung observed that the narcissist functions, often unknowingly, as a shadow mirror, reflecting back the empath's own potential for manipulation, selfishness, and emotional detachment. He documented that empaths often endure what he called the 3 deaths in this crucible. First comes the death of their idealized self-image as purely kind and selfless. Second is the death of the belief that love has the power to heal everyone. Finally, and most importantly, comes the death of their dependence on external validation to feel worthy. The empath must face their shadow, Jung wrote, not through gentle reflection, but through brutal confrontation with their own hidden darkness. In this way, the narcissist inadvertently becomes the catalyst for the empath's deepest psychological work, those who survive. This crucible emerged with what Jung named integrated empathy, the ability to feel without compulsively fixing, to understand without assuming responsibility, and to love without losing themselves. This was not numbness, but rather a state of emotional sovereignty. Neurologically, Jung noticed, such empaths retained their sensitivity but developed what he described as conscious filtering capacity. They could perceive everything, yet decide what to process. It reminded Jung of the mastery achieved by advanced meditation practitioners. Except here, it was not the result of disciplined spiritual practice, but of surviving trauma. Jung captured this paradox in his notes. The narcissist, in their unconscious role as shadow teacher, forces the empath to develop psychological muscles they never imagined they possessed. Yet this discovery unsettled Jung deeply. Empaths who reached this final stage often found themselves increasingly isolated, not because they wanted solitude, but because they could no longer connect with those who remained unconscious. The very transformation that gave them psychological strength also made them incompatible with ordinary social dynamics. Jung found that such empaths could not endure what he called psychological unconsciousness in others. They could instantly detect when someone was speaking from projection, ego, or manipulation. This led to what Jung described as the consciousness gap, a divide between those who had integrated their shadow and those who had not, a gap that could not easily be bridged. M herself described this phenomenon, confirming Jung's fear that reaching the pinnacle of empathic development often comes at the cost of belonging. It feels as though I can see the psychological machinery inside everyone around me. Their defenses, their projections, their hidden motives. Nothing is concealed anymore. This was how one patient described her transformation. But such clarity, she admitted, had come at a heavy cost, the loss of nearly every close relationship. Jung recognized this as the hidden danger of advanced empathic evolution. These individuals developed what he called archetypal sight, the ability to pierce through masks and personas to glimpse the deeper psychological patterns shaping human behavior. This gift made them extraordinary healers, teachers, and guides, yet it also made ordinary social connection almost impossible. Jung captured the dilemma in stark language. They have eaten from the tree of psychological knowledge, and like Adam and Eve, they can never return to the garden of unconscious innocence. Once an empath reaches this stage, there is no going back. Perhaps most unsettling was the way others instinctively reacted to them. People often felt uneasy, even fearful, in the presence of these evolved empaths, sensing on some unconscious level that their inner defenses were transparent. Jung called this dynamic the prophet's isolation, a condition in which one is rejected not for being wrong but for seeing too clearly. He documented cases where families, friends, and even fellow therapists grew uncomfortable, avoiding contact without ever fully understanding why. Through years of observation, Jung identified 4 distinct pathways empaths tend to follow after enduring narcissistic abuse, with only one leading to full development. Type 1. The dissolved empath. These individuals never recover a stable sense of self. Jung described them as psychic ghosts, present in body but lost in perpetual emotional chaos. They cannot distinguish their own feelings from those of others and often fall into victim consciousness, continually attracting new cycles of abuse. Type 2. The armored empath. These empaths respond to trauma by shutting down their sensitivity entirely. To protect themselves, they build psychological fortresses around their hearts. While this prevents further harm, it also severs them from their gift. They often become emotionally detached, cynical, and defensive, choosing safety over authenticity. Type 3. The wounded healer. These empaths use their trauma as fuel to help others, often dedicating their lives to service. Though admirable, Jung warned that this type frequently remains trapped in compulsive rescue patterns. They set boundaries, but still derive self-worth from being needed, leaving them open to subtle forms of manipulation. Type 4. The sovereign empath. This was Jung's final stage of empathic evolution. rare and psychologically groundbreaking. These individuals achieve full integration of their gifts with the shadow aspects of themselves. Jung described them as conscious vessels, capable of holding the full spectrum of human experience without becoming drained or corrupted by it. Unlike the wounded healer, their empathy arises from choice, not compulsion. They no longer give to earn love or approval. They give from an inner abundance that cannot be manipulated. Sovereign empaths possess a rare kind of mastery. They can feel the emotions of others without assuming responsibility for them. Manipulation becomes transparent to them, yet instead of reacting with hostility, they respond with compassion and clarity. They know how to hold boundaries without building impenetrable walls. Over time, they cultivate what Jung described as archetypal wisdom, the capacity to understand human behavior at its deepest psychological roots. What sets them apart, Jung emphasized, is their relationship with their own shadow. Unlike most people, sovereign empaths no longer project their unacknowledged darkness onto others. By embracing and integrating these hidden parts of themselves, they become immune to the very psychological hooks that narcissists and manipulators typically exploit. Yet this evolution, Jung warned, comes with serious costs that left him questioning whether such development was worth its heavy price. The isolation factor. Jung observed that sovereign empaths frequently lived in profound solitude. They have outgrown the psychological level of most humans, he wrote, comparing their condition to adults trying to meaningfully connect with children. The gap in consciousness created an unbridgeable divide. Many reported feeling like strangers in their own families, exiled by the burden of their insight. This constant awareness came with what Jung termed archetypal fatigue, an exhaustion from endlessly witnessing the same unconscious patterns repeat in human relationships. They could anticipate relationship breakdowns, sense political manipulation, and recognize long-term emotional patterns long before they unfolded. The weight of responsibility. Jung also documented the immense pressure these individuals felt. Their heightened awareness allowed them to see solutions to problems others couldn't. But they also understood that unsolicited truths are rarely welcomed. This produced what Jung called the Cassandra complex, the pain of having accurate psychological insight that others dismiss, reject, or fail to comprehend. The demand for authenticity. Perhaps the most difficult challenge, Jung noted, was their intolerance for falsehood. Sovereign empaths had become truth sensors, instantly detecting manipulation, deception, or insincerity. As a result, social relationships became increasingly fragile. Jung summarized it starkly. They have achieved psychological mastery, but at the cost of normal human connection. They have become bridges between the conscious and unconscious realms. But bridges are walked upon, not embraced. The most perilous danger Jung identified, however, was what he termed archetypal possession. Some sovereign empaths became so deeply identified with their role as healers, seers, or truth-tellers that they lost touch with their humanity. In serving as vessels for archetypal wisdom, they risked becoming consumed by it. To address this, Jung developed what he called the shadow integration protocol for empaths recovering from narcissistic abuse. It was not conventional therapy, but a form of psychological alchemy, a process of transforming the lead of trauma into the gold of wisdom. Through this method, empaths could harness their pain without being defined by it, embodying strength and clarity without losing their essential humanity. Stage 1. Shadow acknowledgement. Jung insisted that the very first step for empaths was to face the darker aspects of themselves. This meant acknowledging their own potential for manipulation, selfishness, and even cruelty. You cannot integrate what you refuse to own, he wrote. For empaths, this stage required recognizing how their gifts may have been unconsciously weaponized, how their compassion could sometimes control others, how their victimhood could be used to gain power, and how their identity as the good one might have masked deeper unmet psychological needs. Stage 2. Projection withdrawal. The next step, Jung taught, was to systematically withdraw projections from the narcissist. He explained that what the empath often saw in the narcissist was really a reflection of their own disowned traits. The narcissist's grandiosity mirrored the empath's own suppressed desire for recognition. Their manipulation reflected the empath's subtler controlling tendencies. Their lack of empathy revealed the empath's own hidden numbness. This withdrawal of projection was not about excusing abuse, but about reclaiming responsibility for the parts of themselves they had abandoned. Stage 3. Boundary alchemy. Rather than building rigid walls, Jung emphasized what he called conscious permeability. This was the art of choosing moment by moment what to absorb and what to deflect. Through this practice, empaths developed empathic discernment, the ability to feel without fixing, to understand without rescuing, and to love without losing themselves. Boundaries, in this sense, were not barriers, but alchemical tools for freedom. Stage 4. Archetypal alignment. The final stage, Jung believed, was aligning with the wounded healer archetype. This did not mean becoming a professional therapist, but embodying the wisdom that suffering had awakened within them. Their wounds became a source of compassion and insight, preparing them for a role in the collective unconscious, as examples of what integration and psychological evolution could look like. In Jung's view, this alignment wasn't just personal healing, but a contribution to human development itself. To support these stages, Jung outlined specific practices. He encouraged shadow dialoguing, directly engaging with the parts of themselves they had disowned. He introduced empathic fasting, intentionally choosing periods of non-absorption, allowing themselves to rest from emotional entanglement. And he taught archetypal meditation, connecting consciously with the deeper patterns of the psyche that shape human behavior. The essential insight Jung returned to again and again was this: empaths must stop longing for the version of themselves that existed before the abuse. The chrysalis cannot become the caterpillar again, he wrote. The goal is not recovery, but metamorphosis. To test these ideas, Jung studied historical figures who had endured psychological persecution and transformation. His analysis revealed consistent patterns in how sensitives either achieved sovereign consciousness or were broken by their sensitivity. One striking example was Jung himself. In his private writings, he admitted that much of his psychological theory was born from enduring what he described as psychological persecution by authority figures who tried to exploit and control his empathic nature. "My tormentors unknowingly became my greatest teachers," Jung confessed, forcing me to develop the psychological tools that would become my life's work. Jung's path to sovereign empathy. Carl Jung himself achieved what he later described as sovereign empathy. He did this not by becoming bitter or resentful, but by transforming his suffering into insight. Instead of viewing his tormentors as personal enemies, he studied them as psychological specimens, extracting lessons rather than wounds. Most importantly, he transformed those insights into tools for serving others. His process became the template for what he called empathic integration. Success patterns. Transformation through integration. Jung documented several remarkable cases where individuals achieved similar integration. One was a composer who endured an abusive marriage, yet channeled her trauma into music so powerful that Jung described it as archetypal, speaking directly to the collective unconscious. Another was a physician who, after surviving psychological manipulation by colleagues, developed diagnostic abilities that bordered on the extraordinary. The common thread in these success stories was perspective. Each survivor reframed their suffering not as meaningless cruelty, but as initiation, preparation for a larger purpose. They treated their abuse as a passageway into deeper consciousness rather than as a permanent victim identity. Failure patterns. When sensitivity destroys. But Jung also studied the gifted empaths who were ultimately undone by their sensitivity. He observed two recurring traps. The first was the eternal victim, those who clung to their trauma as their primary identity. The second was what Jung called the wounded wounder, individuals who, instead of healing, used their psychological insights to manipulate and control others. Jung stressed that the difference between the sovereign empath and the destroyed empath was not the severity of the trauma, but their willingness to transform poison into medicine. Failure, he noted, always stemmed from shadow rejection, the refusal to acknowledge one's own potential for the very behaviors that had once caused pain. The need for new relationship dynamics. From these observations, Jung recognized that sovereign empaths required entirely different types of relationships than typical empaths. To guide them, he developed what he called consciousness compatibility theory, a framework for identifying connections that could sustain authenticity and mutual growth. Recognition, signals of evolved empaths. According to Jung, sovereign empaths could often recognize one another through specific markers. They could discuss psychology without becoming defensive, show comfort with paradox and contradiction, and exhibit no need to be right or superior. Many also carried what he called archetypal humor, the ability to find lightness, even laughter, in the darkest patterns of human behavior. Safe relationship characteristics. Jung outlined the qualities of relationships that nourished rather than depleted sovereign empaths. These included mutual respect for psychological boundaries, the ability to share comfortable silence without needing to fill space, openness in discussing shadow aspects without judgment, and what he termed conscious intimacy, connection rooted in authentic self-revelation rather than projection or performance. Community-building strategies. Finally, Jung emphasized that sovereign empaths thrive when they find others who have undergone similarly transformative experiences. These companions did not need to have endured narcissistic abuse specifically, but they did need to have faced some form of psychological crucible, trauma survival, deep spiritual work, or major life transitions that forced rapid evolution. Such individuals, Jung observed, often made the most compatible companions, providing a sense of belonging without regression. The cost of staying small. Jung cautioned against maintaining relationships with unconscious individuals out of guilt or obligation. Transformation, he insisted, cannot be reversed. The butterfly cannot pretend to still be a caterpillar, he wrote. To deny one's growth for the comfort of others dishonors the process of becoming and serves no one. Archetypal service. Instead, Jung encouraged what he called archetypal service, the conscious use of one's evolved empathic abilities for the collective. This could take many forms: teaching, healing, creating, or simply living as a model of integrated consciousness. For Jung, true growth was never for oneself alone. It always rippled outward into the world. The 5 metamorphoses of the empath. Jung described the transformation from wounded empath to sovereign empath as a series of 5 metamorphoses, each with distinct challenges and psychological shifts. The dissolution. This first stage occurs during active abuse, when the empath's old identity completely breaks down. Though it feels like a psychological death, Jung saw it as ego dissolution, the destruction of false self-concepts, clearing the way for rebirth. He called this painful yet necessary process blessed disintegration, the descent. Following abuse, the empath enters what Jung termed the voluntary underworld journey. Here they must confront their shadow, acknowledge their role in toxic dynamics, and face deep fears about their worth and lovability. Though it often resembles depression, Jung emphasized that this phase is actually psychological composting, the fertile groundwork for new growth. The integration. In this stage, the empath begins to selectively incorporate shadow aspects rather than reject them outright. Jung called it selective shadow incorporation. The individual learns to feel anger without cruelty, embrace selfishness without narcissism, and wield power without manipulation. Integration marks the beginning of balanced strength. The emergence. At this point, empathic abilities return, but in a refined form. Jung noted that empaths at this stage could sense others' emotions without feeling compelled to fix them, detect manipulation without reacting with rage, and love deeply without losing their own center. Compassion becomes an act of strength, not self-erasure. The sovereignty. The final stage is the development of what Jung called archetypal consciousness. Here, the empath perceives not just individual psychology, but the larger patterns shaping human behavior. They become conscious bridges between the personal and the transpersonal, embodying wisdom that transcends their own story. Jung estimated that each metamorphosis might last anywhere from 6 to 18 months, with the full journey often spanning 3 to 7 years of committed inner work. Yet he stressed that progress depended less on time and more on willingness, the courage to face shadow and the discipline to integrate, not just heal, the traps. Along the way, Jung also warned of several pitfalls that could derail an empath's transformation, the spiritual superiority trap. Some, after glimpsing their newfound strength, grew spiritually arrogant, believing their trauma made them more enlightened than others. Jung reminded us, the moment one believes they are beyond shadow, they are possessed by it. True sovereignty, he insisted, is always rooted in humility, the perpetual healing trap. Others became addicted to transformation itself, constantly seeking new methods and modalities without ever embodying their progress. Jung called this therapeutic materialism, treating healing as endless consumption instead of true integration. The isolation addiction trap. While solitude is necessary for growth, Jung warned against retreating entirely from human connection. Using psychological evolution as an excuse to avoid intimacy or community leads not to sovereignty, but to stagnation. The path of the sovereign empath. Jung emphasized that the sovereign empath serves consciousness not by withdrawing from life, but by engaging with it fully. Yet he also warned of the revenge trap, the temptation for evolved empaths to use their deep psychological insight as a subtle weapon, manipulating or punishing those who once caused them harm. True integration, Jung wrote, transforms the desire for revenge into compassion for the unconscious. To safeguard against this, he recommended a simple yet powerful practice: daily shadow check-ins. This meant regularly examining one's own motives, projections, and emotional reactions, ensuring that their actions remained rooted in awareness rather than unconscious patterns, an evolutionary leap. Perhaps Jung's most profound insight was his belief that sovereign empaths represent an evolutionary step in human consciousness. They are individuals capable of experiencing the full depth of human emotion while remaining anchored in their own truth. In his words, they are the bridge between ego consciousness and self-realization. As the psychological complexity of human life grows, Jung believed these evolved empaths would serve as midwives of consciousness, guiding others through shadow integration and empathic awakening. Their suffering, he concluded, is not merely personal but archetypal, an inheritance of the collective human struggle. By enduring abuse and transforming it into wisdom, they embody the medicine humanity needs for its next stage of evolution, the ultimate individuation. For Jung, the empath who survives narcissistic abuse and reaches this final stage has undergone the ultimate individuation, becoming fully themselves while at the same time serving something larger than their individual life. His most dangerous yet most liberating discovery was this: the deepest wounds, when properly integrated, become humanity's greatest gifts. The sovereign empath stands as living proof that consciousness can be born out of catastrophe, that wisdom can be forged from suffering, and that what appears designed to destroy us may in fact be designed to transform us. In Jung's final notes, he described the narcissist as the dark priest of initiation, whose cruelty unknowingly forges the very consciousness that will one day heal what they represent. Your journey. Your own path through narcissistic abuse, if embraced as initiation rather than victimization, can become the doorway to sovereign empathy. not in spite of your suffering, but because of it. If you recognize yourself in Jung's vision of empathic evolution, affirm it by commenting, "I am becoming sovereign." Remember, your transformation is not only your healing, but part of humanity's greater evolution. Thanks for watching. And as Jung might say, see you in the next dimension.